long time been believed.
One reason for setting up the Cupid's colony was to establish trade with the island's tiny native population, the Beothuks. There were fewer than 1,000 of these people on the entire island. And since the Newfoundland fishery had been only a seasonal operation, the fishermen rarely saw them. Though settlement expanded, trade was never established. In fact, the Europeans' arrival would have tragic consequences. Diseases brought by the settlers proved too much for the few natives that were here, and today, Newfoundland's Beothuks are but a memory. For nearly all of the first century, 4 nations had participated in the Newfoundland fishery. But in 1588, when Britain defeated the Spanish Navy, Spanish and Portuguese fishing here ceased. Only the French and English remained. The success of John Guy's colony led to English settlements in other areas, and by the mid-1600s, they occupied most good harbors on the Avalon Peninsula. For the most part, the English controlled the fishery along the northeastern portion of the island, while the French maintained a seasonal ship fishery in the southern and western areas. But the arrangement was not a harmonious one, particularly during times of war in Europe. Hijacking each other's cargo was common, even stealing each other's clothes. It was the building of this fort at Placentia in 1662, however, that signified France's first real claim to a portion of Newfoundland. Situated just 20 miles away from the nearest English settlement, the new French fort intimidated British settlers. They made several attempts to capture Placentia, but failed. The French retaliated. Armed conflict in Newfoundland had now begun. A most intensive French attack came in the winter of 1696. The French had carefully planned an all-out military assault. Virtually every English settlement on the Avalon Peninsula was hit. Every structure was flattened. Every house burned to the ground. English fishermen did what they could to resist. Though their hunting muskets were no match for the organized French attackers, all was not lost. Here, on Carbonear Island, one tiny group managed to hold some English ground until the following spring, when the English were able to return and rebuild what French attackers had destroyed. But it wasn't until hostilities ended in Europe in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht that the French threat on Newfoundland soil subsided. One term of that treaty ceded all French territory in Newfoundland to Britain, and French inhabitants were ordered out of Placentia. There was, however, one complication. The French were to retain fishing rights from Cape Bonavista northwards and along the west coast down to Point Ridge. What complicated the issue was a stipulation forbidding English settlement along any area of this French shore. And so, though Britain now officially owned the island, any new developments would be limited to specified areas. The situation intensified half a century later, at the end of the 7 Years' War. Since France had lost all her North American possessions, she would require a sheltered seaport to continue in the New World fishery. The Treaty of Paris provided such a port in the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon on Newfoundland's south coast. Today, those islands are all that remain of the once great French Empire in North America. While national passions separated French and English fishermen, domestic disagreements were more prominent along religious lines. From the early days of British settlement, 2 distinct groups had emerged: the English Protestants and the Irish Catholics. In England, Catholics had suffered repression and persecution ever since Pope Clement VII refused to grant King Henry VIII a divorce from his first wife, Catherine. The very first English settlement at Cupid's in 1610 had excluded those of the Catholic faith. It wasn't until 1621 that Sir George Calvert set out to establish the colony of Avalon, the present-day site of Fairyland, where Catholics might live and practice freely. As the population grew, this religious segregation continued. In fact, it became common for entire communities to be either Catholic or Protestant. Catholics had very few rites in Newfoundland. They could not perform marriage or baptism ceremonies, nor could they own a piece of property. And in reality, they were merely tolerated by the English. Still, they were better off here than they were in Ireland, and their numbers on the island continued to grow. By the mid-1700s, the notion of year-round settlement had taken hold, and Newfoundland's population grew to nearly 7,000. It was around this time that a few of the West Country merchants moved from England to settle in St. John's and a few of the larger outports. These men saw an opportunity to capitalize on the local Newfoundland fishery. By establishing a supplier, or dealer as they were called, in each fishing community, needed goods, everything from food to fishing nets, could be offered for sale to fishermen. But fishermen had no money to buy these items, and so a credit system was set up. A fisherman could now get the supplies he needed and, at the end of the season, turn over his catch as payment. But such a system favored the merchant.
In other words, it was the merchant who controlled the amount of credit that was handed out to a fishing crew and the price of those supplies. Then it was the merchant who controlled the grading of the fish that was brought back and the price of that fish. So that that whole business of the point of exchange, therefore, where there was no cash in question, was controlled by the merchant. This kind of a relationship had the potential to be exploitative in that the merchant could keep a fisherman in debt.
In fact, many fishermen spent their whole lives in debt, and cash was something very few had ever seen. But as Newfoundland's population grew and settlement began to spread further northwards, fishermen found an opportunity to earn cash when they discovered a new commodity: seals. Vast herds of these creatures made their way every spring along the northeastern shore in the area around Twillingate and Fogo Island. But unfortunately for the English settlers, this area was part of the French shore. English occupation here was forbidden. To allow a profitable English seal fishery to develop, a new agreement set out new boundaries for the French shore. From 1783 onward, the new limits for French fishing were set at Cape St. John at the head of Notre Dame Bay and at Cape Ray on the southwestern tip of the island. The seal fishery, like the cod fishery, was run by the merchants. Seals were harvested for their leather pelts, seal meat, and for the oil that was used as lamp fuel. Each spring, when sailing vessels were being geared up for the hunt, eager outport fishermen made their way, on sleigh or on foot, to St. John's. Some of them were no older than 14, but they all had one thing on their minds: to get a berth on board a sealing vessel. It was a hard life. These men worked like dogs. Sealers spent weeks at a time on the ice, working in freezing temperatures and sleeping as they could in the cargo holds on top of blood-soaked pelts. They lived on measly diets of black